I am not a doctor yet. I am just starting my PhD studies, but in the future, most certainly. So today I'd like to present to you my findings regarding emerging pollutants in Latvia. And first of all, a little bit of terminology background. So the term itself, emerging, it comes to us from water quality professionals, and it's meant to describe harmful pollutants that are not currently regulated. And for air pollution, we use emerging pollutants. It's mostly widely accepted across North America. There are multiple criteria by which we could discern whether the pollutant is emerging. There's, of course, whether there's potential or proven risk to humans or the environment, presence of a national standard or any kinds of regulation, if there's monitoring, what kinds of monitoring is happening in regards to this pollutant. Also, yearly emissions amounts are assessed when trying to figure out if the pollutant is emerging. Also, insufficient data concerning sources, background levels, detection limits, and epidemiological studies also points to the pollutant being emerging. In this regard, it is important to mention that even if there are state-level standards, thresholds, maybe some limits, even if there is legislation concerning some kind of pollutant, we could still consider this pollutant an EP candidate if other criteria are present. So there's an interesting theory going out about regulation that as industries for the last 40 years have been concerned with regulated pollutants and have decreased emissions drastically, there is no guarantee that in regards to the emerging pollutants, the same has happened. So the objective of the study was to highlight the need for in-depth monitoring of these kinds of pollutants, and also bring some of the issues up in regards to national network operators' limitations when it comes to monitoring unregulated pollutants, and also create a basis for further research as this topic can be studied indefinitely. A little bit about EPs across Europe. When it comes to Europe, our range of regulated pollutants is much bigger than other regions. Some of the most common EPs registered under REACH regulations are various volatile organic compounds. There's black carbon, of course, as we heard today already, metals and metalloids, metal compounds, and so on. Notable are, of course, microplastics, ultrafine particles, nanoparticles, and some other metals. So a little bit about our monitoring network before we actually dive into what kind of EPs are measured in Latvia and what's the status in that regard. Our network has multiple data sources. Let's say there's our national network run by Latvian Environment, Geology and Meteorology Center. All the regulated pollutants are monitored, and some EPs are monitored. Mostly uses reference methods or comparable methods, and all data is readily available. There are some complications when it comes to private and industry self-monitoring, as this data is very hard to come by. We don't know about the methods they use for measurements. We don't know sometimes what kind of pollutants they're measuring. And yeah, there's a lot of gray areas, and when it comes to industry self-monitoring, the pollutants they monitor are usually the ones that are regulated, because the permit derives from the legislation. And if it's not in the legislation, most likely there won't be a requirement to monitor something that is not regulated. So currently, the national network, and I'll be talking about the national network as this is the only network that monitors EPs consistently and has the capacity to monitor them on a representative scale in the future. Right now, we monitor some sulfur nitrogen compounds and ammonia compounds under EMAP on our regional station, rural. There are some aromatics measured on national level, and there's also automatic measurements of monocyclic aromatic peak xylene. Just peak xylene, unfortunately, but even if we have peak xylene, we can already derive at least some estimates about in-peak xylenes together, about oxylene, because just that could happen. That's possible to do. There have been, as I said, instances when regulated pollutants may be considered EP candidates. And currently in Latvia, there are 6 regulated pollutants that have never been monitored. And there is significant gaps in regards to what kind of monitoring, indicative measurements or modeling has been done in regards to these pollutants. There's a lot of gray areas and we don't know much about these, even though they're regulated. So I would consider them EP candidates. But it doesn't mean that we haven't ever monitored something that's not out of the ordinary. There have been automatic measurements of formaldehyde and ethyl benzene. We don't really know the date they were discontinued, as this information is not public. And there's been a range of metals also analyzed in labs until 2009. Reasons for discontinuing are varied. When it comes to the BTX group, there are some limitations in regards to specifically the analyzer used. The AR500, as some of you may know, it uses array. So there's the array and there's the receiver. And when it comes to BTX group, the frequency at which the BTX group is measured is very sensitive to outward influence. And if the analyzer, if the ray, for example, moves just a fraction, like nitrogen dioxide would still be measured, but the BTX group would have significant problems as it needs a very steady ray all the time. And that's unfortunately is very hard to do. So the amount of BTX is limited for what we measure, but that's only until 2022. I will tell you about the plans for the future. Another reason is that the center is not only a state enterprise operating the national network, it also does commerce. So the laboratory capabilities are very limited in regards to what it can do. So sometimes there's unpredictable amounts of other work that the lab should do. And there has to be a balance between what is done for on a government level and what is done for commerce. There have been speculations that modeling and indicative measurements have been proven to be enough to assess these pollutants, though unfortunately I haven't found any indications whether there's some reports or something that modeling has been done consistently on a routine scale, something like that I haven't seen. And there's also a reason that such measurements are high cost for the lab, for a state enterprise, and under current legislation, they are unsupported. But it doesn't mean that everything is dark and dreary. There are plans to modernize the network. Currently, the center is working very hard on that. And starting in 2022, the pollutant range will be expanded. Finally, ethyl benzene, one of the regulated pollutants that haven't been measured since God knows how long, is going to be measured on an automatic scale on the whole network level. Also, the whole xylene range will be measured on automatic level, which is also great. And when it comes to our EMAP station, there's going to be organic and black carbon analysis additions in small particles. But unfortunately, no pollutant range will be expanded for laboratory analysis workstations in cities, in the whole network, just this one EMAP station, but that's already could be enough to have at least some understanding about the background levels on which to build everything else. It's very hard when it comes to assessing what could be the sources of these pollutants in Latvia, as there are no knowledge about background levels, or at least enough knowledge about background levels. I've analyzed the Latvia's informative inventory report, and unfortunately there was no differentiation given for VOCs, for metals, for example. The VOCs have all been lumped together, and there's a whole estimate for the whole group, not specific pollutants. There's also significant overall uncertainty reported when it comes to the emission amounts that they have estimated, smaller for trends, but still present. And what's very important is that transboundary effect has been not accounted at all. And there's not enough information to estimate background concentration. In regards to background concentrations, that was one of the key conclusions we have come up with, that the current monitoring level and gathered data is not enough to accurately describe sources and background levels. Also, it's been found that national monitoring networks operators sometimes lack the agency and support needed to make drastic expansions of the range of pollutants that they are measuring. In the center, they're just the implementing body. The executive body would be the ministry. And as I said in the very beginning, there's of course future research ahead of us. And some of the things that I'd like to do in the future is, as the range of EPs is vast, there are thousands of pollutants, there has to be a prioritization algorithm adjusted, created for Latvia specifically, to find out on which pollutants concentrate our attention. Some of these criteria derive from the definition of the emerging pollutants that was in the very beginning, but notable additions are, of course, recommendations from World Health Organization, perhaps some existing regulation somewhere in the world. There's also emission amounts, and when we're talking about emission amounts, it's very important to actually create this number, let's say, taking into account the population density and area size, because the emission amounts that are meant for example, Canada, which is 1 ton, would not be attributable to Latvia. So it has to be adjusted in some way. Also very important is for us to choose pollutants that we are able to measure with the methodology available to us. So there could be a situation where we won't be able to measure some important pollutant just because the methodology is not available, but that is yet to be seen. And it is my opinion that it is highly important to at least start this sampling process and create a sampling point, if the center so allows, at the EMAP regional station to gather information about the background levels on which to base everything else. Because without that, that's not really representative data for measured dust in the city. So that would be all from me on my part today. Thank you very much. And I'm ready for any and all questions that you may have for me.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra. This was very interesting. Is there any question for Aleksandra? I'm curious how
Recording
are,
in progress.
I'm curious how are these volatile organic compounds selected for monitoring? You mentioned only xylene and later ethylbenzene, but not benzene and other compounds. And what is the instrumental technique for this monitoring?
I've talked today only about emerging pollutants. Everything that is regulated, everything like benzene, toluene, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, all the particulate matter, everything is measured on a routine level for more than 30 years. It's just that the ones that have insufficient monitoring or the ones that have insufficient regulations were mentioned today. Everything else that is required from us by the European government or state legislation, we do, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. No further question for Aleksandra, I suppose.